A very good evening to all our viewers today. Today we have with us one of the sharpest mind in the world in this space of sustainability and CSR. He's a fellow of Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership and also the chair of Antwerp Management School for Sustainable Transformation. Let us all welcome Professor Dr. Wayne Visser. Today we'll be speaking about his latest book, Thriving. Welcome on our show, sir.
Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to join you all, and I hope we have a good conversation.
Looking forward to it, sir. So, your book "Thriving" is a remarkable book with a lot of examples in it. In one of the chapters, you mention about possibilists. In fact, the very first chapter. What would you mean really with the word possibilist?
Yes, it's not a word that I can claim as my own. So the wonderful Hans Rosling, who was a statistician, some may have come across him through his work through gapminder.org, where he illustrates many global trends using visual techniques and data. So he has a wonderful book called Factfulness, but he was the one who introduced the idea of a possibilist. Somebody asked him, is he an optimist or a pessimist? And he said, neither, he's a possibilist. And simply that means that you're not having a blind optimism or a despairing pessimism, but rather you are believing that change is always possible.
Oh, wonderful, sir. So, in your very first chapter, you mentioned about Achut community in South Africa and the way they are thriving out there, using all the natural resources. But they do face healthcare challenges due to lack of access. How do you see that they are faring now? Is that resolved, and how do you see them filling up the gap? And also, when you were there personally, what were the key takeaways for you? How can we embed sustainable living in our day-to-day work life?
Yes, I think the case you're referring to was the village that I visited in the Amazon in Ecuador, the Ashwa people. And indeed, they in some ways are living extremely sustainably. They live right in the middle of the forest. We had to fly for an hour on a small plane through over the forest just to get there. And they have no roads giving them access actually to the markets. So they have to travel by river and by foot. It can take them several days to get to the nearest road. So on the one hand, they are thriving in terms of their harmony with nature. They get everything they need from the forest, and they actively are fighting against the government and the mining companies who want to exploit the forest for minerals. But they are a poor community. In other words, they're low income, and they don't have their own healthcare facility. They have to use a flying doctor who comes in an emergency, or perhaps comes once a week. And so I used it just as a way to illustrate that we need thriving across all dimensions of life. We need to thrive with and in nature, but also, of course, we have to look after our human needs, and we have to look after our health and well-being. And one of the ways that we have to do that is also by giving economic opportunities. In fact, when we did a little bit of work with this Ashwa nation of indigenous people in the Amazon, one of their biggest priorities is to get a road and to get a way for selling their goods on the market. And so I think this is always an important thing to remember, is that thriving needs to integrate the social, the economic, and the environmental.
Wonderful, sir. So I hope it would be. So they are using flying doctors right now also.
Yes, I think that's still the case. Um, they are a minority population in Ecuador, and so it depends also a lot on the government and how progressive the government is. But at the same time, they have a very strong voice. They're very well organized. They have great leadership. They're very clear on their own cultural identity, and they keep looking for those opportunities to improve their economic situation and, as a result, also their health. But you asked what can we all do if you want to bring it down to the level of the individuals also. And um, you know most of our impact is in very few activities. So it's what we eat, um, it's how we move around, our mobility or our transport. It's obviously about what we buy, and it's about where we work, and finally also what source of energy we have. So if you look at a study like Project Drawdown, which is compiling all the science on climate impacts, in their top 5 most effective actions that we can take, it's things like changing to a more plant-based diet. It's using renewables. In this case, wind energy is rated the number 2 in terms of impact. It is things around food waste, cutting your food waste. We waste, of course, a third of our food globally, and that has massive implications. And then there's also tropical forestation and restoration. So scale that down to your own situation and just think about, where do you get your energy? Is it fossil fuel energy? Do you have an option to make it renewable, which is more and more possible all around the world? As you know, renewables are the cheapest source of new electricity in almost every country in the world now. And then, what are you buying? Are you giving preference for organic food, for fair trade products, for products with less single-use plastic, products that are made from recycled content and that are recyclable, so embracing the circular economy? There are many choices we can make about what we buy. And sometimes that also means making sure we don't just buy the cheapest, because the cheapest means that somebody is probably getting exploited in the value chain, in the supply chain. And then, of course, where do you work? Are you working for an organization that is a purpose-driven organization that is bringing actually solutions to our social and environmental challenges? Or are you working for an organization that is actually part of the problem and is having a big negative impact? So those choices all matter. And when we all make the right choices, then the system starts to change. It's also our how we use our voice, right? What movements do we join? Which causes do we support? Are we part of the climate strike movement, or the Black Lives Matter, or Extinction Rebellion, or whatever it is that you really care about? You can amplify those voices by joining. And of course, in some countries, including in India, we have the power of the vote, and we really need to use that vote to get the right leaders in power as well.
Excellent, sir. That's so true. True that you mentioned about it. Now, in your book, you did share with us 6 key ways to thriving. Would you like to elaborate the same for our listeners?
Yes, I mean, what we're looking at here are, well, there are a couple of different things. So there are keys to thriving, which are really the scientific keys underlying the science of thriving. But perhaps more what you're referring to are the six transitions, the great transitions that we have to make in society in order to reach thriving. I think here it might just be helpful if I do share my screen for a moment.
Sure.
So let me see if I can just quickly find. So are you seeing this slide now with the six great transitions?
So you may have to click on share button at the bottom.
Okay, I thought I did that. Okay, I thought I did all of that. Let's try again. Share screen, window. Okay, how about now?
No, sir, it's not coming. It's
Okay.
a button right next to the settings button.
Yeah.
There is a
I've clicked.
share.
I've done all of that, so it's not working. So no problem. I'll just talk you through it. So essentially, there are two transitions related to nature, two transitions related to society, and two related to the economy. This is a way to simplify so many complex issues. If we look at what's breaking down in our world, then we see firstly the degradation of ecosystems, like the beautiful forests I see behind you. So, this is literally the fraying of the web of life, and we need to change that to restoration of ecosystems. We know already since 1970, we've lost 2/3 of the wildlife populations of the world. That took 3.8 billion years to build up. And we know that we're losing vast amounts of land, water consumption has gone up. A lot of this is to do with land use change, especially for agriculture. So we need a different model of agriculture. And of course, we need to protect and restore all of those forests, and also think about the oceans, where we also need to protect and restore. The ocean, remember, is one of our biggest and best carbon sinks. It absorbs a lot of our carbon. So that's the first transition, and we talk about an eco-services economy. So through the market, we can actually support what nature would normally do for free, and help it to bounce back, effectively give it time and space to recover. The second transition then is from degradation, from depletion of resources, natural resources, to renewal. So what we need is renewable energy, but we also need renewable resources as much as possible, rather than non-renewable resources like fossil fuels. And we need to therefore also embrace the circular economy. We need to go to a world of zero waste, where materials are either organic and go back to nature without doing any harm, or they are made by artificial manufacturing, such as chemicals and plastics, but then they need to go back into manufacturing. They can't end up in the environment. So this is through the circular economy. Those are the two nature transitions. In society, we have to go from disparity, which is, of course, all about inequality in society. We have to go to responsibility, where we have diversity, equity, and inclusion in our workplaces and in our societies. And we call this the access economy, because it's all about giving, especially the marginalized and the excluded groups, access to economic opportunities. Then we have to go on the health side from disease, not only infectious diseases like COVID, but non-communicable diseases like heart disease, diabetes, cancers, and strokes, which is how 70% of people die today. We have to address these. And in fact, 40% of these are preventable because they're lifestyle diseases. It depends on our diets. If we have a very meat-intensive diet, for example, or whether we're living in polluted cities, or with polluted food chains, toxic chemicals in our food chains. And of course, if we have poor habits like smoking. So we can actually prevent 40% of those. This is, of course, a form of revitalization of the human health. We shouldn't forget also mental well-being. 1 in 10 people suffer from severe anxiety today, leading to depression, sometimes suicide. And that's a number that's been going up. So we must take care of that. And this is all through the well-being economy. So those are the two societal transitions. And then in the economy, we have to tackle disconnection. And this is really the unequal access to technology. There is the digital divide. Still half of the world's population doesn't have access to the internet. Roughly a third doesn't have mobile phones. So that's one kind of access we need to address because it makes inequality worse. And then we also have to look at the technology that we do have and ask whether it's being used to solve the social and environmental problems, or is it actually making those problems worse? So whether it's the fourth industrial revolution technologies like blockchain or artificial intelligence, big data, 3D printing, digital twins, all of these have the potential to tackle social and environmental problems. So we call this rewiring our technologies through the digital economy. And the final one, which we have learned a lot about in recent years, is disruption. And that has to do with crises and catastrophes. This can be pandemics, it can be wars like the Russian war in Ukraine, it can be climate events, floods, droughts, fires. And we have to go from disruption to resilience. We have to learn how to minimize the risk of that crisis, but then when the crisis hits, to help people survive, to cope, and move through the other side, bounce back. And so this is a lot about managing risk. So these are the great transitions we have to make to prevent us going into breakdown. We have to have these transitions to break through in these 6 areas.
Wow, that's very insightful and very helpful for all of us to pave our own way towards sustainable transformation. Sir, apart from this, recently COVID-19 has actually made the world come to standstill for almost close to 3 years. You mentioned about 10 systems thinking way, what we should use to come back to the reality of life, and that we all should be applying it in our lives. What would those be?
Yeah, so I think we've learned a lot from COVID, and it's exposed also the weaknesses in our systems globally as well as nationally. But we have also had some very positive takeaways. Now, I won't go through all 10 lessons, which I have in the book, Thriving, but to give an example, we've learned that we can change very fast when we have to. We can actually dramatically change our lifestyles, our behaviors, if we really decide it's important. And governments can take much more dramatic action than we thought. So when we think about bigger crises that will have even larger effects like climate change, the excuses we get from both the public, the citizens, and government really are just saying that they don't think it's as urgent or as harmful as COVID-19 was. But in fact, we know it's probably going to be a lot worse. So we know that we can change dramatically if we have to, and that's what we need to do. We also learned a lot about exponential change, which is how most change happens. What does that mean? It means the way that the virus grew. So when it started in China, of course, it seemed like just a few cases. It was local, nothing to worry about. And we had a few cases reaching Europe, again, nothing to worry about. But they were all doubling every 3 or 4 days, and then we saw how the curves, the statistical curves went, how fast the infection spreads when it gets going. And that's really how most change happens. It's not a linear process, and that's been visually and visibly demonstrated for us by COVID-19. Now we have to apply that thinking to many of the other issues that we face, and to realize that we've been exploiting our resources at an exponential rate. All of this continuous economic growth has resulted in overconsumption and extraction of resources. Of course, nobody wants to stop, because everybody wants to improve their quality of life. But when you do that in a finite system like our planet Earth, at some point it collapses. So we know this as well. A virus will eventually collapse as well when it runs out of hosts, out of humans to grow and incubate in, or when we find a vaccine, or we starve it through social distancing and so on. So we need to apply this kind of thinking of exponential growth also to our other issues. We also saw that innovation is amazing in a crisis. So we had lots of companies adapting, making ventilators and making sanitizer, hand sanitizer, very quick innovation that happened. And that's the kind of innovation we're going to need for our other crises. We need to know again that this is really possible, and that we're running out of excuses for making the sorts of changes that we need to make. So, as I said, I won't go through all of them, but it gives you a sense that we can learn a lot from this crisis that we've been through. We've learned that we don't have to travel everywhere for meetings. We can do like what we're doing now, although I do hope I'd get to visit your lovely campus there one of these days. But we've learned to do things differently, and that's really important.
Thank you for sharing the ways we could use to come back to reality post COVID-19, and I completely concur with your thoughts. Now, thriving is primarily also focused on regenerating Mother Earth, the sea, implementing regenerative agriculture, carbon sequestration. You mentioned about sky diamonds. Would you share some more similar examples which we could use to regenerate Mother Earth? Also, in certain parts, you mentioned how we could be in nature and heal ourselves. So that was an interesting concept that you mentioned. Will be great to learn from your own personal experience if you did so.
Yeah, in fact, the earth needs healing, and mostly the best thing we can do is to give it time and space. We really have crowded out nature in so many ways, and we just haven't given it the ability to regenerate. What we find is when we step back, when we create nature reserves, either in the oceans or on land, actually very quickly nature can bounce back, but we need to give it that chance. There is a lot we can do. You mentioned regenerative agriculture. This is absolutely critical. Our agro-industrial model is really what has decimated the earth. It's wiped out biodiversity. It's left our soils completely lifeless. You have to eat 8 tomatoes today to get the same nutrients that our grandparents got from one tomato, because there's just no nutrients left in the soil. It's just through constant use of chemical fertilizers, it's been depleted. So regenerative agriculture is a movement. It's gaining momentum. It's a lot about being organic, but going even beyond that. There are lots of techniques there. Of course, it doesn't use chemicals, but it really is about putting the life back in the soil, and also having techniques for that, around crop rotation, around using different crops and livestock, in fact. So there is a whole movement happening there, which is absolutely vital. But then, like I said, the ocean is one of our biggest areas for solutions. If you take seagrass as an example, it absorbs carbon 30 times faster than tropical rainforests. So we need to restore the seagrass. If you take something like seaweed or kelp, we can use kelp farms to rapidly absorb carbon and then either use that for food or simply sink it to the bottom of the ocean so that it is permanently out of the atmosphere. So there are a lot of creative things we can do. We can also use technology. So we can use drones to rapidly replant forests. We can also use satellite data to make sure that we understand where the impacts are, where there's illegal deforestation. So a real example here is in Kosovo. Through Sustainability Leadership Kosovo, they have a campaign on deforestation where they've used satellite images to show the rate of deforestation over the last few decades. And, this is now data that can't be argued with by the government. And there's a whole campaign now of committing to reverse this deforestation in Kosovo. So we can use technology for sure. And we need to be creative. That's if you like, the business side. But as you mentioned, we also know from psychology that nature is a healer of us, and that there are many health benefits from spending more time in nature, mental health benefits especially, but also physical. There's a wonderful concept in Japan called Shinrin-yoku, which is forest bathing. So you literally, like you would go sunbathing, you go into forests to soak up nature, and it's very therapeutic. And I've had so many of these experiences. I share quite a few of them in the book. I think the one that I used to illustrate was in a forest in Thailand, where we got to lie in these rock pools. There were fish all around us, nibbling on our toes, surrounded by nature, and it was so calming. And the problem is that we mostly are living in cities, more than half the world, and we're surrounded by traffic and pollution and noise. And so we have to also look at how we bring nature back into where we work. And that includes the idea of biophilic design. This simply means the love of nature, but green walls, where you have literally living walls, where you have plants growing, and green roofs, where often the biodiversity on the green roofs is higher than in the surrounding countryside. These are things that we really need to embrace.
So thank you for taking us to the cities. Now, in your book, you mentioned something on sponge cities. Would you like to share how we can implement the same concept in Mumbai and Delhi, which are the most polluted and populated cities? How do we make our cities green cities?
Yeah. So sponge cities are the idea that you need to create wetlands in your urban spaces. These are areas that you have a lot of vegetation, you have reed beds and sort of lakes and so on. And what this does is it allows you to be more prepared when flooding happens. Because normally what happens is in an urban area, you get a lot of rain and there's nowhere for the water to go. Very soon the storm water drains are overwhelmed. And so it just accumulates in floods. And that's devastating, of course, for people and their livelihoods. Sponge cities are where you have these wetland areas where excess water is rapidly absorbed by nature, by these wetland areas. and so it soaks it up. It can take far more in the way of heavy rain and flooding. And so just bringing these green spaces back into the cities is not just about people having, nice leisure parks, but also it has very real economic and social implications. There's a related concept which I talk about in the book, which is these mini forests. So I think they call them pocket forests. So you can very densely plant a mix of trees in very small areas of just perhaps 10 square meters or something like that. And this has massive benefits. The biodiversity, of course, increases, again, absorbs water. So, in many cities like Mumbai, but many others, space is at a premium. And so we have to also think creatively, and wherever we can find pockets of space, we need to densely plant diverse trees to make these mini forests to help us to bring nature back into the cities.
All right, that's very interesting, and I hope some of the people from the government would be listening to this. Uh, so
Just on
thriving,
that,
yeah.
Harsha, it sparked another thought which I also wrote about, which is green space is also a social justice issue. We sometimes think of it as something that everybody wants, of course, but when you analyze a city, it's the poorest who have the least access normally to green space. So the mayor of Los Angeles talks about shade being a social justice issue. And so what often happens is when we regreen cities or we do tree planting, they go to the richest areas, right? Maybe it's where they can afford to plant. But in fact, what we should be prioritizing are the poorest areas where they have no shade and where they would really benefit from having trees, having nature. So we have to be very conscious in everything we do on environment that it has a social dimension and a justice dimension.
That's very interesting. You see, in India, we also consider a tree as a living being. So they are not allowed to cut the trees just like that. There's a lot of permissions and regulations come into picture.
Yeah.
So now in your book Thriving, it is also a breakthrough movement for the economy. You mentioned about three pioneer economists and how we could build a more inclusive economy, considering now most of the economies across the world are depleting, and this is the time that we could rebuild them. So, how do we rebuild an inclusive and more sustainable economy from here?
Yes. At one level, this is about what economic thinking we bring to the problem. So for the last 50 years or so, we've been bought in to this understanding of economics, which we sometimes call neoclassical or neoliberal economics. And it's basically saying, leave the market to itself, just have as little government intervention and regulation as possible. The free hand of the market will solve all the problems, and let companies just grow. And unfortunately, that's been pretty disastrous certainly for the environment, and in some cases for increasing inequality. So what we need to do to build an inclusive economy is to change the model of economics that we have. There are lots of different words we could use, but stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder economics is a pretty good description. It can't be economics only for those that have the power and those that are already privileged. What stakeholder economics is about about designing a system where there is government intervention, but also where there's a voice for civil society as a balancing power, where we really get the balance right between the economic interests of government, of business, and especially the providers of capital, the shareholders, so that it doesn't mean that one takes all the power and it's at the expense of the society. What we've learned over the last 50 years is that if you leave the markets to themselves, you just increase inequality. So we need very intentional policies, both to protect the environment while ensuring that there is enough incentive for creative innovation and economic growth, as well as protecting society. You know, before the Great Depression, the original Great Depression of the 1930s, we had a world that was more or less as unequal as it is today. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like the top 1% earned 70% of the income or wealth. And that's more or less where we are today. But after the Great Depression and 2 world wars, governments actually designed policies to bring equality back into society, so that we ended up, you know, with the top 1% only having 15% of the wealth. So, you know, I think we have to let go of this idea of the free market just running wild, and we have to have good policies. This is not government telling business what to do. Government still has to create an enabling environment for economies to flourish, but it needs to set the standards, the social standards, what is acceptable, for example, in terms of labor conditions, and the environmental standards. Where do we need to get to? Net zero carbon, for example, by when? With stage posts along the way, biodiversity protection. If they set the standards, they then leave it up to business to innovate, to actually, you know, find the solutions and stay within those standards.
Very well said, sir. You mentioned about innovation in the conversation. Now, considering the times are changing and everything is getting digitized and the world is getting smaller, connectivity is more easy. What are the tools to achieve sustainable transformation in these times and in this era?
Yeah, there are in some ways, you know, an abundance of tools. It's really a case of getting out and using them. So we have many standards. That's the first thing. There are about 450 sustainability standards in the world today. That's probably way too many. So one of the things we have to do is consolidate the standards. But then we get, you know, we get tools like circular economy and life cycle assessment, which will really help us to make the right decisions. We get frameworks like donut economics, and applied at a business level, the Future Fit business benchmark. What that does most importantly is recognizes planetary boundaries and social foundations, and sets what it calls break-even goals. In other words, how do you get to, you know, just not having a negative impact, and then also sets positive pursuits, which is the idea of going net positive. That's the essence actually of thriving. So there are tools like the Future Fit business benchmark that will help companies to implement these ideas. There's really no shortage, I think, of tools. We just have to find what is relevant for our particular industry, for our work, and apply it. So I don't really think that's so much the barrier. The barrier is more about whether we have people taking the leadership to set the ambitious goals and then just get on with implementing them. We know the time is short in terms of some of the crises like climate change. And so what we need more than anything is action. We need an experimental or an innovation mindset where you You just take action, and then you learn from the action that you've taken. You fail fast and you fail early, and then you learn from that. And that's the way I think that we're going to innovate through these crises and turn breakdowns into breakthroughs.
Excellent examples. Now, in the last chapter, you mentioned about the Japanese way of Ikigai and Takumai. So I would like to understand from you, what are your reasons to work for social causes? What is your Ikigai and what is your Takumai?
Yeah, so Ikigai, for for people who are not familiar with that concept, is really your reason for being. So it's what is your personal purpose, and that's a very powerful concept. So for me, it's whether I can be a good storyteller of the possibility we have for making a better world. If I can inspire some other people to firstly believe and to be hopeful that we can reach a thriving future, then that's a lot of, I think, what my purpose is, since that's probably what I'm best at, is writing and speaking and making films and being really a storyteller, because the world is run by stories. We are a myth-making species. Myth not in the sense of lies, but myth in the sense of narratives, and it really matters what we believe. And the problem at the moment, I think, is that there is a narrative that everything is breaking down and that the future is, is catastrophic, and there's a huge amount of despair and anxiety, especially among young people. And I do think we have to change that narrative. We have to recognize that the challenges are large, and the issues are urgent. They need action. But in that action and in the innovation and in the positive tipping points, we can actually be hopeful about the future. We can see a way that many of the transformations we need will happen quite quickly as various trends converge and reinforce one another. So that's my ikigai, if you like, my central purpose, and everybody will have their own. It's about finding what is the unique thing that you bring to the world and to your life, and that's very much to do with purpose. What are you uniquely able to do? What is the way that you, in a way, craft your own life to make the world better for other people?
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your personal experience. One of the questions from our student, Mr. Gladson, is where do you see ESG moving in the next 10 to 15 years? What will be the major development in ESG in the coming years?
Yeah, this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because we've had these different movements. We had CSR, and I founded CSR International as well. But I think CSR always suffered from a lot of legacy and a lot of limitation and a limited interpretation, that this is a lot about philanthropy and very socially focused only. And so we got sustainability, which became more a triple bottom line. People, planet, profit, environment, social, economic. And I do notice now that we see this wave of ESG, environment, social, and governance. It comes, of course, mainly from the investor community. It comes from the financial sector. Now, on the one hand, that's good, because we need the financial sector to be engaging. And I think that governance has been, to some extent, neglected in our discussions on sustainability. So I'm glad for that. And I do see that it will increase, right? The language and the practice of ESG. There's also a danger, though, that the financial sector framing of sustainability will again bring us a very limited view on this and try to bring everything back to financial and economic impacts and business case arguments. So I think we have to ride the wave and take what's good from it. But this is also why I would rather frame it in terms of thriving or net positive or regeneration, because I think these sort of models where we say, that environment is somehow separate from social and governance is something different, or economy is something different. This is a false division, because in complex living systems of which we are a part, everything is integrated. There really isn't a separate society that's separate from nature, and there isn't a separate society that's separate from the economy. So that's just a little health warning, I suppose. But what I do think will happen is that we'll see a real convergence around the need to report on ESG. That's been building, of course, for many decades, since 1993, when we started doing sustainability reporting. But we are starting to see a real consensus on reporting, public reporting by especially large companies. I think we're starting to get a consensus around what indicators that should include. We've got the World Economic Forum stakeholder capitalism metrics, which I think will start to be adopted. We've got the EU directive also now on sustainability disclosures. So there'll be a whole lot happening in the transparency of ESG data, if you like. I also expect that this will drive the financial sector to be a far bigger catalyst of sustainability or thriving. We saw just an early indication of that at COP26 in Glasgow, the Conference of Parties meeting on climate change in November last year. And 450 of the top banks and insurance companies around the world, representing $130 trillion of assets under management, committed to fund the transition to net zero. Now, that's roughly 40% of the world's assets under management. So this is a massive commitment. And what they will be doing, therefore, as this ESG movement builds, is going to all of their clients, which are mostly companies from all sectors, and asking them what their transition plans are to get to net zero. And so we have all of these positive reinforcement effects as a result of the ESG movement being something that the finance sector is really taking on board finally. So I think those are two changes that we can really watch. I do think the bigger change, though, is this shift beyond sustainability, because I do say that there are three problems with sustainability right now. Firstly, it's not clear after more than 30 years. Still, if you ask two people what sustainability is, you'll get two different answers. And the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17, may actually make things even more confusing, because some are problems, some are solutions, some are contradictory. So it's still not clear what it means. Some people think it's just environmental. Some people think it's about continued economic growth. Secondly, it's not working. If we look at a lot of the trends in terms of ecological collapse, in terms of social inequalities, and so on. And thirdly, sustainability is boring. It really is not inspiring. If you think of what sustainability is, the ability to sustain ourselves, of course we want to do that and we have to do that, but it's not what gets us excited. What gets us inspired is to say we want to thrive. And so the bigger change I see in the next 10 to 15 years is the adoption of this thriving, or it's also called net positive or regeneration movement, which is not about how do I make some positive contribution to the economy, some to society, but I trade off the environment or nature. It's about how can everything I do result in a better society, better nature, better economy. How can the world be better for me having existed? And me could be me as an individual or me as a company. And I think that's going to be the new test of net positive thriving and regeneration.
I totally agree with you. How to be net positive is the next challenge for all of us. Now we have few comments from the LinkedIn viewers and few questions as well. I'll take you through them. Shritu Chopra, love the idea to bring the nature where we work. Mr. Sujay Jha has a question. How do you link tree economy to carbon credit and ESG fundamentals? Mr. Sergey mentioned about the government.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Rabindra Kumar Mohanty has a question on, could you kindly light on how to advance inequality, justice, social justice for the indigenous community people?
Let's try and address those three, otherwise I'll forget what's been asked. So,
sure.
I think the whole thing of what you call the tree economy, let's call it the restoration of forests, is absolutely crucial. And I'm a bit worried at the moment that, there's so much skepticism about offsets, carbon offsets, that a lot of business and industry is waiting and not taking action on supporting restoration of nature. Whereas what we know, of course, is that it's a nature-based solution to climate change. And of course, we need to improve the reliability and the methodologies, the verifiability of our ways that we measure those offsets. And we have to insist that every organization reduces their direct impacts from operations 90+% and uses the offsets only for the remaining 10%. But we really need to embrace the restoration economy in terms of nature, because it has so many benefits. It's not just climate benefits, but of course, the devastation of biodiversity. So it has that benefit. And if you do it right, if you do it in an inclusive way, then it can also bring social benefits. I think that there is, it is going to be a booming trend towards using, the restoration of nature for offsets. And we have to be very vigilant that it's not just greenwashing. We have to improve our standards, but we must really embrace this. And the finance institutions also need to embrace this. Just remember, though, that restoration doesn't only mean land-based restoration. As I mentioned, some of the best kinds of restoration we can do are in the oceans. We get far more bang for our buck from a carbon perspective, even from a biodiversity perspective. If you restore mangrove forests, for example, along coastal areas, you create habitats for young fish, you protect those coastal areas against storm activity, and of course you get a carbon sink where it's absorbing carbon. So absolutely critical. Then there was a question on Russia, I think. That was, I don't know if it's quite a big question. And in fact, for those who are interested, I have written shortly after the war broke out with the invasion by Russia, I did write a reflection piece on leadership and what kind of leadership we need for thriving, based also on research that I've done on leadership. And so, what we see, I think, with what's going on with Russia right now is exactly the opposite of thriving. It's everything that we would not want to see. It's something that speeds breakdown. I mean, wars are always catastrophic, and it's an old style of leadership that is all about power and acquisition, and it really doesn't have a place in today's world. Now, from a systems point of view, though, I do think that it may have some positive knock-on effects. I think that in the medium term, let's say within 10 years, the Russian conflict will have speeded our transition to renewables, because now getting off of fossil fuels, initially, of course, getting off of Russian fossil fuels, but this kind of vulnerability that we have is a vulnerability to all of our sources, wherever we get our fossil fuels from, will be seen as a national security issue now. And so far better to have something that you can generate reliably yourself through renewables and other non-fossil fuel based energy. So I think it could have some of those implications. I think it also, a little bit like Trump's time in power did, it reminds us what's important and what we should be fighting for. What is it? What are our values? And it's created a solidarity around the world behind more, let's call them, liberal values. And I think that's a good thing, that we need to constantly fight for justice. And what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine is just reminding us of that. And then just remind me of the third question. Social justice of indigenous communities. It was interesting at COP26. I think it was the first time that indigenous voices were really being heard. And I think that's a big shift. What we're realizing, especially in the climate agenda, is that indigenous communities are far better at managing our land and resources than many other groups. And so giving power back to indigenous communities, hearing their voices, I think is finally being aligned, especially with the climate agenda. But this is a long, long battle that's been going on for many years. I mentioned Ecuador. I mean, they're fighting for their rights there in the Amazon, but all around the world, indigenous communities continue to have to fight for their rights. All we can do is use whatever sphere of influence we have to support the rights of indigenous communities, to amplify their voice, to give them a platform wherever we can, to lobby and to pressure our governments also to be supporting rather than undermining indigenous communities. So it's really about recognizing their value in a way that we haven't really done very well in the past years. But I do see the tide shifting on that. This is the moment where we have to really take advantage of the openness we seem to have now to listening a little bit better to indigenous communities. But of course, because they've been exploited and marginalized for so long, there is a lot of justice that needs to happen. And that really means investment. We need to invest in those communities to ensure that they have the economic opportunities as well as the social voice. So I see one more question there from Nalim, and then I'm not sure. I think we may be running out of time. But the issue of sustainable menstruation or menstruation cups, and many other issues to do with hygiene, feminine hygiene. I think these are important solutions. I don't think there are single solutions, but anything that we can do to firstly empower women and make sure that they are able to make their own choices, but then to look at the materials we're using in what we produce and consume as much as possible, to go away from the throwaway economy, but always making sure that women have the choice over their own bodies. So yes, I see that and many other things as part of the solution, and anything we can do to encourage those initiatives is a good thing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Visser, for answering all the questions so patiently. Do you have any final message for all of us?
Yes, I think that what I would say is you don't have to change the world, right? In fact, you can't change the world. So you should give up your anxiety. You should give up the idea that, there is this overwhelming task that you have to save the world. Well, for one thing, the world will save itself. I mean, if you're looking at the Earth will look after itself. It'll take millions of years to find balance again, but we have to be worried about ourselves, not the Earth. But my message is really that you shouldn't try to change the world. You should try to change your world. You have to look at what is your sphere of influence and just make whatever bold actions and changes you can make in that sphere of influence, because by the nature of complex living systems of which we are a part, little changes that everybody makes in their local areas will be connected and ripple through the system and accumulate and result in these positive tipping points. So I think it's all about taking local action in your own life, but also in your work life, in your family life, and just doing what you can to be a force for thriving. And linked to that is the idea that you should never give up hope. The worst thing that we can have right now is cynicism and despair and anxiety. I think we have to turn our worries or our concerns about all of the issues that we face into positive action. And when we do that, and when we tune in to a lot of the changes that are happening, a lot of the innovations, a lot of the accelerations of solutions, when we connect with others who are working on solutions, then I think we can have what I call a pragmatic hope for the future, that we can create a thriving world, which is, after all, what we all want.
Thank you, sir. And something for our group, for our institute?
Well, I also work in education, much like you do, and I think that education is the catalyst, one of the big catalysts for making the changes that we need. Until we have a different mindset and a different heart set, I would say, so until we think differently but also feel differently about the world, we won't make the changes that we need. And that starts with education. It starts with creating solidarity among people, especially young people, to move us in a direction that we really want to go. I might just suggest, I always try and do this because I know we're sort of running out of time, that I end with a poem, because in fact in the book I also share poetry. I'm not only a professor but also a poet, and I think that's part of engaging with the heart, not just the mind. So if you will indulge me, I will
I was going to
end.
ask you that.
So in fact, I think I'm going to end with a poem that's not in the book, but it certainly talks to the theme of today, and to my final message that I had for you. And it's called A Place to Thrive. Is the world a better place because we lived and loved and learned? What will our children have to face because of what we built and burned? Are people better than before because we gave them dignity? What happened to the sick and poor while we were living strong and free? Is the world a fairer place because we fought for equal rights? Who lost for us to win our race? Or did we open up new heights? Is nature thriving, great and small, because we walked upon the earth? Did oceans rise and species fall with every breath we took since birth? Is the world a dying place because our enterprises grew? Did we destroy our living space, or did we seed the world anew? Each day we get to use our voice to raise the tide or let it ebb. Each day we face a simple choice, to nurture life or fray its web. Let's let the world be better still for every moment we're alive, because we chose to use our will to make our earth a place to thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the wonderful poetry. And we really cherish the time that you spent with us.
Thank you, and all the best with your work and for all the listeners for your impact in the world.
Thank you, sir.